Welcome back to Romans chapter 2 as we get into week 6 of our series, Romans chapter 2, verses 12 through 26. If this is your first time joining us for our Romans series, we want to welcome you and love to have you here listening in as we get going through Romans chapter 2. We're going to finish up Romans chapter 2 this week before moving on to Romans chapter 3 next week. As a reminder, this is going to be a 30-week overall study, and so we are going to have some opportunities to pause, take a few breaks, make sure that everybody is caught up to where we need to be. Again, if you have not met me before, I'm Jordan Vandenheuvel, and I'm the one teaching this class. This has been a great privilege for me, and I look forward to hearing from you all about things that you like, dislike, things that you need answers for, all of that stuff in the comments section of this video. So please join us down there. If you have the opportunity, and you're listening to this fairly close to when it was released, we are currently having this study available. It's at Homeport Christian Church in St. Augustine, Florida, and we're going to be starting in week 7 this upcoming week. And so come and check us out. Look us up on Google and check us out there. If you have any questions, send an email to jordan@homeportcc.org, and that'd be awesome. I'd love to hear from you on that. As we get started in Romans chapter 2 this week, we're going to answer a few questions as we usually do. I'm going to give you guys a bunch of questions that we're going to answer through this lesson. In Romans chapter 2, verses 12 through 26, we're going to answer kind of 5 major questions and ideas this week. The first is, what are the differences between Jews and Gentiles? And we're going to talk a little bit about what ancient Judaism really looked like. Then we're going to talk a bit about what is the problem for both Jews and Gentiles. We're going to get really into that in Romans chapter 3, but we're going to kind of highlight that a little bit early. Another thing that we're going to sneak peek a little bit is, did the Jews have a special blessing, and what did they do with that blessing? Because that becomes very important later on in the lesson, in the letter of Romans. And so we're going to talk about that a little bit. And then godly Gentiles, is that even possible? And I think we will clearly see that the answer is yes. And we'll see a couple of results, or a couple of examples of that. And then we're also going to talk about how to be Jewish today. And notice how I have that in quotes, not actually Jewish in the way you're thinking, but we'll talk about that a bit later on in the lesson. On the first slide, you're going to see a read the text section, and I think that's important. I think you all ought to read the text. In order to keep this video fairly short, this is a commentary style video, and so I hope that you would pause here, read Romans 2, verses 12 through 26, and you can read that in any good Bible translation. Those are not just the ones that I have. Those are not just the ones that I've listed. The NIV, New Living Translation, King James, New King James, CSB, NASB, you can go with any of that. I will have read and written this commentary in the ESV, and so if that's something that you have access to, that would be great, but don't worry about it. In any good Bible translation will do. I say translation just to make sure that we're using a translation, not like a paraphrase. Nothing wrong with some paraphrases, but just want to, for serious study, we probably want to be in a serious Bible translation. And so any of those will work out just fine for you. In Romans chapter 2, verse 12, we're going to see right off the bat that all people, Jew and Gentile alike, will perish because of their sin. Now, remember I told you last week, this first couple chapters of Romans are pretty much bad news. And that's because what's happening here in Romans 1 and 2 and the first half of 3 is that Paul is building a desperation. Remember, he's writing this to a Christian audience, and so they will have converted to Christ already. They will understand who Christ is. And so he's going to highlight some things, but he also has to make clear that before we became Christians, we were damned. We were without salvation. We were sinful and sinners, perishing in that sin which we loved. In this, all the peoples of the earth have the same problem. Jew and Gentile, if you remember, is inclusive of all people everywhere. That's Jew and everyone else. That's the whole world. Now, a quick note on Judaism in the first century, around the time of Christ. I think this is kind of interesting. They held to a Pharisee and Sadducee system. And I'm going to use two theological words here, and I want to make sure that this is clear. I don't mean politically, I mean theologically, conservative and liberal. Now, Pharisees would have been considered the theologically conservative branch of Second Temple or ancient Judaism. And that's important to note because they believed in the resurrection of the dead. The Pharisees believed in the resurrection of the dead. The Sadducees did not. And we see this interaction with Jesus a couple of times in the Gospels. And it's clear to us that the Sadducees did not believe in the resurrection of the dead, which meant that essentially they did not believe in an afterlife in the way that we would think of. And so I think that's very important. Very quickly in the New Testament, we stop really responding to the arguments of the Sadducees because they don't really make sense in terms of the Old Testament itself. They are kind of syncretizing with the Roman world, with some religions that surrounded them. And so very quickly, the New Testament will start to write against Phariseeism or Judaizers who are telling Christians that they have to observe Jewish rites and religious practices and feast days and all of this stuff as a way to be saved. And so that's who is kind of in view here in Romans. But I did want to point that out because I think the Pharisee-Sadducee divide is important because the Sadducees are wrong because they deny the resurrection of the dead, but the Pharisees are also wrong because as Jesus calls them, they are whitewashed tombs, meaning they're pretty, they look good on the outside, they look holy on the outside, and yet on the inside they're filled with dead men's bones. And so I think we ought to recognize that as we read. The Sadducee error is easy to see. If there is no resurrection of the dead, then there is no afterlife. Then there's no reason to avoid sin. Possibly aside from a material blessing here on earth, there's really no reason to do anything else because if you die and you stay dead, then God can only punish you so much is kind of their idea. The Pharisaical error, and that's quite the word, is harder to see, but also harder to get rid of. We still struggle with this today. The Pharisees taught that your salvation and the salvation of the nation was tied to your following of the law and their additional law books. And I think that ought to sound a bit familiar to us. This is known as the classic religious error. The Pharisees preached that salvation came by working to appease God. That is what every religion in the world believes except for Christianity. Christianity is the lone religion where your works do not get you into heaven. Everyone else believes that your works earn you something. Sometimes that's very clear, as in the karmic cycle in Hinduism and Buddhism, where you do good things, you get rewarded, you do bad things, you get turned into an earthworm or something like that on your next reincarnation, all the way up to Mormonism, which is your eternal destiny, which heaven you go to is determined by the works which you do. And I think those things are very common in other religions, except for in Christianity, we don't believe that. We believe that we are saved by the grace of God, the free gift of faith in our lives. And so that is a very, very different understanding and one that Paul is going to make very clear. Is it possible to attain salvation without the grace of God? No, but theoretically, what it would take is moral perfection from the moment of your birth and being born of a virgin because of original sin. We're going to talk about that later in Romans chapter 4 or 5, I believe. So Paul is claiming that unless you are perfect, which no one is, you will perish in your sins apart from grace, Jew or Gentile. The only way you can be saved is through Christ, John 14:6. And so notice that there's only one person that meets those requirements, and that is Jesus Christ. And so that helps us to see that Paul is insinuating that only Christ could pay the penalty for our sins, and he did so already. Romans chapter 2, verse 13, and I promise we'll go a little bit faster from here. I just wanted to make sure that we were clear on verse 12. Verse 13 is pointing out that the admiration of the law of Moses, the pride of the Jews, will not help them unless they do what it says. And spoiler alert, they don't. As we said already, Jesus is the only one who does what the law says. And so who are the doers of the law? No one. No one are people that do what God has commanded them, except, again, for Christ. We can see that in Romans chapter 3, verse 20, verse 28. And you can also see that in Ephesians chapter 2, verses 8 and 9, which we will cover even more deeply here in just a few minutes. That is a giant slap in the face to Pharisaic Judaism. I don't think we can fully express how much of a slap in the face that is to Pharisaical Judaism. To be honest with you, that is such a different understanding than what they thought. They thought you earned salvation by working, or by being a part of the people of God in that you were Jewish, and so you didn't really have to you didn't have to act like anything. You were either just a person of God or you had to work for it. And so both of those understandings would be wrong. We're given faith and yet we act accordingly. And that's going to be the message that Paul preaches throughout the book of Romans. Romans chapter 2, verses 14 through 16 talk about that there is a promise that some Gentiles will follow, and they know that God is real in their lives. And I think there are many examples of Gentiles who follow God throughout the Bible, a couple of them being Ruth, who is the famous Ruth from the book of Ruth. She is a Moabite woman, and so notice there that the commandment of the Israelites was to not marry people from outside of Israel, but obviously that was not followed. But with Ruth, I think it's interesting. She commits herself to Naomi and says, "Your God will be my God and your people will be my people." And she continues to follow God to the point of being married to another Israelite man and being in the lineage of Christ, along with Rahab. Rahab is a prostitute from Jericho, and she helps the spies in the land and is a Canaanite woman, and yet again she is included in the people of God. She's somebody who follows God faithfully, even though she is a Gentile. The woman at the well is another great example. Jesus talks with the woman at the well in Samaria, and she is a Samaritan, so she is what would have been known as a half-breed in the New Testament times. The Jews looked down on them because they had intermarried with and commingled with the Gentile people, and so that would have been seen as an affront to what God had commanded them to do. And the Samaritans didn't really like the Jews either, so it was a big angry thing. And so the woman at the well would be another great example. She goes and becomes a great gospel teller in her city of the coming of the Messiah. And then finally, the faithful centurion, who is a Roman, and he is one who Jesus meets on the road, and he says, "Jesus, my servant is ill and he's paralyzed. Will you save him? Will you heal him?" And Jesus says, "Yeah, let's go to your house. I'll go and heal this man." And the centurion stops him. He's like, "You don't need to come to my house. Like, I command people. I know what it is to command someone." And he's like, "It's just by your word. And so you just speak and he'll be healed." And Jesus says, "I have not seen greater faith than this in all of Israel." And he heals the man's servant. And so we see examples of faithful Gentiles, Gentiles who follow God throughout the Bible. And we see this because of faith, because God has given it to them to be saved, to be followers of God. Now, this is interesting, and this is a point where I will link an article from the Gospel Coalition to the online course of this video. And so if you are not connected to that, that is a great opportunity. You can go back to the first video. We have a full thing of how to do that. I hope that you would do that. That is a great option for you if you want to learn more about this. You can also read a bit of this slide, and I'll read some of it for you. I won't go super into it for span of time, but you can read the rest of that article for it. But faith given by the gift of God. We don't often think of faith in that way. We think of faith as something we do, and yet that would transform it into a work. And usually in the ancient church, the first couple centuries of the church, they did not view it that way. They viewed faith as something that was given by God. And that's asserted by Abraham Kuyper. He's a Dutch theologian, lived from 1837 to 1920. He did a research into the idea that faith is the gift of God. And he did that through using early church theologians who were native Greek speakers. And this is important because nowadays, no one's a native ancient Greek speaker. There are native Greek speakers still, but the language has changed significantly since that point 2,000 years ago. That's just the nature of language. And so he looks back at how these 7 or 8 different ancient Greek theologians, people that knew the language, that were around people that knew the language, viewed it. And most of them, 7 out of the 8, viewed it as this pointed to faith. And so I'm hoping that's helpful to you all. I hope that you'd read Ephesians 2, verse 8. If you have not, I would like to read it just so that we can clarify it, and then hopefully you will go on to continue to read that article if you're interested in this study. For by grace you have been saved through faith, and this is not your own doing, it is the gift of God. So what is not your own doing? And this is not your own doing, it is the gift of God. It could be that the whole sentence before is what's being referred to. For by grace you have been saved through faith. So salvation by grace through faith could be what he's talking about. However, most ancient Greek speakers would have thought that that would be referring to faith. For by grace you have been saved through faith. And that faith is not even your own doing. It's also the gift of God. Now that is a tough reading because it puts us in the passive, but I think that fits fairly well with biblical theology. And so again, you can disagree with me. That's totally fine. I will link that article so that you can read through it. He goes much more technical than I do. And so I hope that you enjoy being able to read that. Just wanted to point that out. It does help us as we continue through Romans, because I think Romans as a whole speaks highly of the election of God. And so that's one of those points. So just wanted to bring that up there. Romans chapter 2, verses 17 through 24 points out for us that hearing the law does not count. Simply being a Jewish person by birth does not mean you are automatically a Christian or will become a Christian. Paul will make this abundantly clear in Romans 9, verses 30 through 33. Salvation is a gift from God, not a work to be worked for. Judaism seems to, according to Paul, to be known as a hypocritical religion in that time, if you read verse 24. And that's certainly the impression that we get from Christ when he calls the Pharisees whitewashed tombs. Matthew 23, 27 through 28. Then we get into the fun little ending of Romans 2, where he talks a lot about circumcision. I will spare you the description of circumcision, except to say that it is a physical sign of a spiritual covenant. Now, this physical sign would have been somewhat clear. Of course, if you know what circumcision is, it's an important part of the old covenant system that was established through Abraham. Sorry, there's a typo on the screen, but is not a free ticket to heaven. It notes that someone is ethnically Jewish. Nowadays, a lot of people are circumcised for cleanliness reasons, and so there is a difference there. Something I did find that was interesting in this, he speaks of circumcision as if it would make it clear to surrounding people that one is a Jew. And I thought about this and I was like, well, how in the world will everyone know? Because it's a private part of the body, generally speaking, in most cultures around the world. I thought that was interesting. And so I looked into it, and it actually is because it would have been very clear. Because in that time, public bathing culture was very much a thing, and Judaism really appreciated that because they tend to be a very clean religious group, especially around that time, physically clean. And so this would have been a clear signifier to the surrounding culture that someone was Jewish, because when they went to the public baths, things looked a bit different. And then you could notice that they were Jewish. That also makes it very clear when they're being hypocritical, because obviously you couldn't really hide that you identified as a Jew and yet also were acting out in a certain way. And so that's really all I'll say about physical circumcision. It would have been very clear to the Roman culture who was and who was not Jewish. Romans chapter 2, verse 29, we're going to spend 2 slides on this. With the death, burial, and resurrection of Christ, the people of God will be known by their circumcision of the heart, not a physical circumcision. To be a Jew inwardly is referring to the spiritual reality of the Christian as someone who has entered into covenant with God by circumcision of spirit, not body. We're baptized by the Holy Spirit and fire. And I think that's very important to us today. We're the people of God. And what Paul is referring to here is the Jews were the people of God in the Old Testament. Christians are the people of God in the New Testament. So when he uses the term Jewish, he's referring to the Jew inwardly, referring, of course, to the spiritual reality of the Christian as circumcised of spirit, not body. So you can be saved, you can be a Christian without being physically circumcised. Therefore, the Old Covenant laws have been fulfilled in the perfect one, in Jesus Christ, and we fulfill the requirements of the law by grace through faith in him. And remember what we talked about with faith. Anyways, now the question I asked at the beginning was meant to be purposefully a bit confusing. How can you be Jewish today? Well, not by following Judaism. The people of God today is the church, and there is no other way to be saved than by believing in who Christ is and what he has done for you. And so I hope that this has been helpful to you all as we continue through Romans 2. Look out for Romans chapter 3 coming up a little bit more quickly than this video came out. Romans chapter 3 will be out fairly soon, and I hope that you guys enjoyed that. Again, let me know if you have any questions or concerns in the comments below. I'd love to hear about it. I would recommend not Googling circumcision. That is not super helpful. But if you don't know what that is, I'm sure there are some write-ups about that, and you can be both amazed and horrified about that sign. And so I hope that you guys enjoyed this video. Please join us again. If you haven't, please like and subscribe to this channel. That way you'll get all of the notifications for the things that are coming out as we continue through this 30-week study of Romans. Thank you guys so much.